Welcome to the Holy Post. Elon Musk announced his takeover of Twitter by carrying a porcelain sink into the headquarters. Will his plan to loosen restrictions on social media help or hurt the country? Then, archaeologists have discovered a new way to verify events in the Old Testament, but Phil wonders if anyone really cares. And is it ever loving for Christians to mock their opponents? We talk about 6 rules for Christian mockery from the 17th century and why they may not apply today. Then spiritual director Ruth Haley Barton joins me for a conversation about how to see the Sabbath as a gift rather than an obligation. All of that, plus the saving power of worm spit. Okay, a quick plug before we jump into the episode. We're heading into the holiday and gift-giving season, so I want to remind you that we still have Holy Post merchandise for sale on our website, including limited edition 10th anniversary merchandise. So if there's somebody in your family, household, or friend network that's a Holy Post fan that would love to get some merch for the holidays, be sure to go to the Holy Post website and check that out today. Here is Holy Post episode 533.
Hey there, welcome back to the show. This is Phil. I'm here with Christian Taylor. Hi, Christian.
Hey, how are you?
Good. And Sky Jitani. Hi, Sky.
Hi, Phil.
If you're watching on video, Sky's wearing a driving cap. Is that a driving cap?
I don't know what you call it. Beanie?
I don't think it's a beanie. A brown flannel shirt and a brown driving cap, which brings to mind the cast of the musical Newsies.
My favorite musical.
Is it really?
For.
Yeah, well, I think you've hit the ball out of the park. And now, speaking of musicals, time for the theme song. What's the news that you like the most? Who's your favorite podcast host? If it's breakfast, get your toast. It's Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. Sky and Phil and the Holy Post. And sometimes Christian. Okay, we're back. Did any of you do anything particularly interesting in the last week? And Christian or two?
Sky, you go.
I filmed a curriculum for my book With downtown in Lincoln Park and at North Avenue Beach. And it was very, very cold, but hopefully it will be a very good curriculum.
Okay. Did you, when you filmed at North Avenue Beach, did you have to wear a swimsuit? Like you were up there to go swimming?
No, I was not actually in the sand or the water, but right on that breaker wall.
Yeah.
There. So you had the whole city skyline behind me.
Yep.
It was a beautiful, like perfect blue sky day, but it was really cold.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really,
I saw
really
you
cold.
tweet about it.
Yeah.
So did it go smoothly? Did they call you the one take wonder?
I can do video pretty well. Yeah.
Okay.
And because it was so cold, my mind was very sharp, but the words did not always get to my frigid lips without some mumbling. So, but for the most part, I think we finished 3 hours ahead of schedule. So I think that speaks well.
So they give you a bonus for that, right?
Right.
Because they can send all the freelancers home and pocket the extra cash. So, okay, we got some animal news to start things out. I'm actually going to try to do this week. I'm going to try to do a few more shorter stories. It's going to be more shorter story week as opposed to one big deep thing that, is crazy. More shorter. Okay, got it?
So more of a holy post-potpourri. Potpourri.
Holy post-potpourri. It's after the pourri, it's the post-pourri. Worm spit could be a secret cure to the world's plastic problem.
What?
Is that exciting?
Which plastic
that
problem?
seems so odd.
All these years, we've been looking at worms when they spit on the sidewalk and just thinking there's nothing good could come of that. Nothing.
I've never
good.
seen a worm spit.
Nothing good could come from worm spit. The saliva from the beeswax-eating waxworm, or Galeria melanella, if you have that, you have to have it frozen off your forehead, could be harnessed to break down the world's most widely used plastic, according to a new study published in the journal Nature Communications. A polymer called polyethylene, or PE, makes up around 30% of the plastic we use every day. So they've been trying to figure out, is there a bacteria? Is there something that can break down polyethylene? Because it's all over, it's in the ocean, it's everywhere, it's in our bloodstreams, it's in our noses. We're just all covered with polyethylene. And these researchers discovered that one particular species of worm, the larva of that worm, have in their saliva, wow, this is specific, a compound that naturally breaks down polyethylene.
So, do they have to actually harvest this from the worms?
Look, can you hear the sound of a worm spitting? That's the sound it makes.
Okay, but do they have to get this from the worm, or can they now manufacture it, artificially?
Sky, you ask good questions. Those are good questions. I assume other people are asking those same questions.
I was.
They have to figure out how to produce it. Yeah.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
How did they figure this out in the first place?
Experiment. They experiment. You just keep experimenting. Try this worm. Make him spit on this plastic. Did that do anything? Okay, now let's go to beetles. How many beetles are there? 1 million different species? Okay, let's start with this one. I don't know how someone had a theory. Someone tested the theory. There's enzymes in the waxworm larva's spit. So once he's a grown-up, doesn't work anymore. Got to get it from the larva. And they don't eat the plastic, which would be really handy because then you could just have the worms grow in dumps and they'd eat all the plastic and there'd be 40 billion waxworms in every dump. But they don't eat the plastic, so you actually have to recreate the saliva or learn how to teach them all to spit on command. So whoever did all those flea circuses back in the 1930s, if they can train waxworm pups, larvae, to spit on command, we can solve the biggest problem other than the bigger problems facing humanity today.
So does that mean once you use this enzyme from the saliva on the plastic and it quote unquote breaks down the plastic, that those smaller molecules or whatever are no longer dangerous?
I don't know.
Or is it just they're smaller now?
Sky, you're asking questions.
I know.
That a scientist can only answer.
I don't
know. Phil Vischer. He's a humorist and a Christian thinker.
I would enjoy hearing what exactly a spitting worm sounds like.
Yeah. Me too. Okay, next story. See, there's going to be short and there's going to be more. So we're going to have fun. It's going to be a fun day because we need to have everything. Just can't be doom and gloom. Look what white evangelicals are doing now. We just can't do that all the time. That's fun some of the time, but it's like, eating pizza. Pizza's great. You can't eat it all the time. Sometimes you need some curry. So today is more of an Indian buffet. Different things, smaller portions. Here we go. Elon Musk just bought Twitter. It happened. It went through. Elon Musk owns Twitter. And this is where it gets interesting because I don't know if you've noticed this, he's a little bit eccentric.
Just a little.
Have you noticed that, Sky?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, I like that. I heard you sipping your tea right next to the mic. That was very nice.
I was trying to make the sound of a spitting worm.
Oh, okay. Yeah. This could be one of those podcasts where you just have noises like of breathing or eating that people listen to.
No one does that.
So that's the thing.
Okay, so Elon Musk is most well known for Tesla.
And SpaceX.
Yeah, but mostly Tesla. Like people know Tesla. They see Teslas every day, whatever.
Yeah.
And some people love those cars. Other people are more skeptical. The quality's questionable, whatever. But I was looking, just because he's been in the news lately, I saw Tesla down the road. And I thought to myself, if I had the means, like a couple years ago, I would have been interested in getting a car like that. I don't have the means, but had I had the means. But today, if I had the means, I'm not sure I want a Tesla. Partly because I don't know if I want to support this Musk character.
This Musk. He's a little musky for me.
I don't think that way about any other automobile brand because I don't associate it with one person.
Well, it's kind of like Jeff Bezos and Amazon. It's like, is he doing more good than bad? And do I want to keep sending him money? So Elon Musk marched into Twitter on Wednesday to claim, this is Barry Weiss writing on her Substack, to claim his new toy, the company. He entered the building carrying a porcelain sink. Did you hear about this?
I did.
There's actually a picture of him walking into Twitter headquarters with a porcelain sink in his hands. Why? To make the joke. Let that sink in. It was a taunt to his detractors. Let it sink in that I own your favorite place. Let it sink in that Donald Trump is coming back to Twitter. Let it sink in that you're not in charge anymore. At one point, he floated the plan to fire 75% of the company's employees, which he has not done yet, but he has already fired the CEO, the CFO, the policy chief who was in charge of censoring people for saying bad things. So he's kind of wiping out the leadership of Twitter. And he's going to replace it or not replace it? Is just going to have a couple of Tesla engineers make all the decisions?
It's kind of interesting. Do you know, normally, even in a takeover like this, you don't fire the executive team before you've got a new one to put in place?
Well, no. Here are the steps of taking over a company. You bring them a ceremonial sink, and then you fire all the leadership. That's how you take over a company.
Has anyone else done this? Is this a stunt that he read about somewhere else, like bringing a sink? Because it's a little, it seems not just juvenile, but not very creative.
Yeah, you would have done something much more elaborate.
Probably.
Yeah.
I'm into elaborate
Christian,
stunts.
Does this make you more excited about Twitter or less excited about Twitter?
Truthfully, I am really sad about it. I've been enjoying Twitter. I like it that it, is not as, poisonous as it was a year or two ago. And I'll be interested to see if I want to continue based on what changes he makes.
Well, but hasn't it been a little boring without Donald Trump on Twitter?
No.
A little boring?
No.
We need more sources of things that are obviously not true that our relatives can send us.
Maybe I'm an elitist, but as I look at the world right now, I think we would benefit from more editorial standards, not fewer.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that Elon Musk wants to come in and remove the editorial standards that have been put in place, I can understand somebody making the case that the standards are unfair or they need to be revised or they need someone to come in and judiciously look at are they being applied equally? But to say, let's just get rid of them for the most part, I don't think that's what the world needs.
I don't think he can get rid of all the standards.
No.
Because they'll end up in legal jeopardy if they do.
But he's getting rid of a lot of the ones that sound like they're helpful, like not spreading seditious lies through a huge megaphone that riles up a country to go to war with itself. I think that's a pretty good standard.
The thing is, for me, it isn't so much about Donald Trump being on or off Twitter. What bothers me is the standard that he sets for everyone else. And we've seen that kind of rhetoric change people and change the course of our discourse. So whether it's Donald Trump or not, it has been really nice to have that rhetoric scaled back and not be so poisonous. And I am very sad about the fact that may come back.
See, it's funny because, and this is like, Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida going after Disney. We love it when people are shut up that we disagree with, and we're infuriated when people are shut up that we agree with. So, and it's always the other side that does cancel. Our side never does cancel. Our side stands up for the truth. So, people that are applauding, yay, no one should restrict, what you get to say on Twitter, it's free speech, are some of the same people that are saying, yay, Ron DeSantis for telling Disney they can't just say whatever they want to say, because they're woke. Yeah, so it's really like, what are we? And the same thing happens on the other side sometimes. I'm not doing a both-sidism, but there's a little bit of, no, you can't say that because, that's insensitive to, pick a minority group or a group that has been oppressed, and you can't use that word or that phrase. And you should be shut down, for doing that. So there's a little bit of it on both sides. And depending on which side you agree with, you decide the other side being censored is for everyone's good.
Sorry.
Christian hung a sheet over her orange to be less orange today, and the sheet is falling down. So now she's a quarter orange. A quarter orange!
Are we going to stop this?
No, you can go do something about it if you want to. I'm just going to roll.
I'll be right back.
Okay, you be right back. I am going. Can you still hear me, Christian? Can I keep talking? Yes. Okay, good. Next story. We're flying along. We're having fun. We're going fast. You guys can discuss amongst yourselves whether you think Elon Musk. I'm worried about the world becoming too dependent on billionaires for all of our major infrastructure. It's like we don't want to do things collectively anymore. So we want a single guy to be in, like the amount of stuff that Elon Musk controls, the amount of stuff that Jeffrey Bezos controls, the amount of stuff that Apple controls, which is a little less, single guy focused than it was. That's just, Zuckerberg. Those billionaires are making so many of our decisions for us.
This is why some people are arguing we've entered a new Gilded Age.
Ooh.
Similar to the late 1800s, early 1900s, when there were the robber barons, the railroad barons, the oil barons, the what's his name? Yeah, the Newsboys era, basically. Like they ran the country and they had mega power, and it ended up leading to a lot of problems, and it led to unions, it led to communism, taking root in various places, and it ultimately led to the Great Depression. But you also needed a reform movement to come up against that, which is Teddy Roosevelt and all the stuff that came up, antitrust legislation. And right now we're in a new digital Gilded Age, and we haven't yet created the laws and structures to deal with it, which is part of the reason why there's no oversight for social media to know what the standards are and what you can get away with.
We can't agree. I mean, it was easier to get people to agree robber barons are bad for everyone. It's, but when you say Twitter being completely unrestricted is bad for everyone, half the people say no, because you're going to restrict my side. And the other half say, well, yes, we should, because your side is evil.
But that's why, I don't want to give the government too much power either, but that is where the courts having some say in how a law is enforced and making sure it's done fairly is a little bit easier to deal with than I'm just going to trust Elon Musk. I don't think that works either.
Yeah.
So
no.
Right.
Well, there's no accountability to an Elon Musk. We can't, we can't vote him out of office. We can't. We can protest, and I'm not going to use Twitter anymore. But oh well. What do you think? Let us know. Next story. Do you know what we haven't done for a very long time?
What?
A Bible archaeology story.
It has been a long time. That. You're right.
Yeah. Are you ready for one of those? And I'll explain why I haven't done one in a long time after I do this one. Geomagnetic fields reveal the truth behind biblical narratives. Okay, that's almost like worm spit solving our problems. Geomagnetic fields are proving the Bible. A joint study by TAU, I don't know what that is, and the Hebrew University involving 20 researchers from different countries and disciplines has accurately dated 21 destruction layers at 17 archaeological sites in Israel by reconstructing, now try to follow this, by reconstructing the direction and or intensity of the Earth's magnetic field recorded in burnt remnants.
I'm sorry, Phil, you're going to have to break that down for me.
So here's the deal. Geophysicists attempting to understand the mechanism of the Earth's magnetic field track changes in this field throughout history. And here's how they do that. So they can tell how was the Earth's magnetic field lined up? How strong was it? Which direction, which angle, specific angle was it at any specific time in history? The way they can do this, they use archaeological findings containing magnetic minerals, which when heated or burned, record the magnetic field at the time of a fire. Isn't that interesting? Wow. I didn't even know that was true. So if you find some iron ore, you find something that has strong magnetic properties, and it was in a fire, if it was hot enough, it kind of freezes the Earth's magnetic field as it was at that time.
It's a snapshot.
So what they did was they dug into 17 different archaeological sites in Israel Some of them, they know specifically what date this burned down. They know from other records or other archaeology. And so they found magnetic ores that told it here's how strong the Earth's magnetic field was that day when this happened. Now, if you get a couple of those, you go compare them to other sites. And what they were specifically looking for, like in a certain conquest, the Babylonian conquest or the Assyrian conquest, the Bible says these 5 cities were all destroyed by this one king. If that would be the case, then the burn layers would have, these fragments that would match each other. You following me?
Okay.
Me?
So it's a dating system.
It's a dating system.
Not like carbon dating. It's different.
Yes. And so here's what they discovered. Based on the similarity or difference in intensity and direction of the magnetic field, we can either corroborate or disprove hypotheses claiming that specific sites were burning during the same military campaign. So, some researchers have said, relying on archaeological evidence, for example, have argued that Judah was not completely destroyed by the Babylonians, that parts of it were destroyed by the Babylonians, and then parts of it were destroyed later by the Edomites, taking advantage of the weakened kingdom. Now the magnetic results support this hypothesis, indicating that the Babylonians were not solely responsible for Judah's demise. Several decades after they had destroyed Jerusalem and the first temple, sites in the Negev, which had survived the Babylonian campaign, were destroyed probably by the Edomites, who took advantage of the fall of Jerusalem. This betrayal and participation in the destruction of the surviving cities may explain why the Hebrew Bible expresses so much hatred for the Edomites. For example, the prophet Obadiah. So they went through 17 sites and they discovered overwhelmingly that the dating evidence supports the biblical narrative. What do you know about that? The new data verify the biblical accounts of the Egyptian, Aramean, Assyrian, and Babylonian military campaigns in the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Okay, so here's why I used to do more stories like that, and I don't do them very often anymore. I'm just not sure it makes that much difference.
Oh, Phil, you're hurting so many people with that statement.
I used to think, if we could just get more evidence that the Bible isn't, fictitious, that it's not a book of fairy tales, that it's accurate, we get more accurate, people will become Christians. And now I tend to think, I don't think they care that much how accurate the stories of the Old Testament are. I think what they're looking at is Christians are not very nice people. I don't want to be one of them. And whether or not the burn layer of a development in the Negev matches the burn layer of Babylon in the invasion, I just don't think it moves the needle much anymore.
Okay, hold on though. Couple things. First of all, I don't want to dismiss the research and study that was done here because it does
it's valuable.
It's valuable for historical analysis and all that. So that you're talking about just as an apologetic tool.
Yes, I don't find it as useful as I used to.
Okay, so that brings up something that I've had numerous conversations about lately, which is when I was a college student or 20, 30 years ago, maybe it's more now, the big question that people were asking is Christianity credible? And so the reliability of the Bible and things like that were relevant topics that came up a lot. And to your point, Phil, I don't think people are asking, is it credible? I think they're asking, is it plausible? Meaning, can you actually live this way according to the faith of Christians? Yeah. And why would you?
Yeah.
And when they see the hypocrisy that's prevalent in the church today, or when they see some of the teachings of the church and look at contemporary values and they go, that's impossible. You can't live that way. That's ridiculous. So people are looking for plausibility, and the apologetic for plausibility are lives well lived. It's people actually following Jesus and living out his commands in the public square and in their personal lives. And apart from that, you're right. I don't think, the dating of burnt embers from the Babylonian conquest aligning with the dating of the Bible are going to move too many people.
Mm-hmm. Christian?
It matters to me.
But we've already got you, Christian.
You're in the camp.
I know, but this is what's so interesting. I was so excited when you read that because I don't know, Sky, if I did this on Christian Asks or not. did we just talk about this? About there not being any, a lot of historical evidence to back up things that are in the Bible. So, for example,
No, we didn't talk about that, but it's a good question to bring up on a future one.
Yeah, let's do that. I had this conversation with someone because it's been bothering me. Like, when they put the manna and the tablets in the Ark of the Covenant?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And it said many years later that they were still in there, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm dying to find that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just dying to find it. Have somebody find it. How cool would that be?
It's in the Well of Souls in Tunis, as we learned from the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
It's in a government warehouse. I thought it was in a
I don't know.
warehouse. Yeah.
I just think it would be amazing if we had more in the archaeological record of what we know to be true in the Bible.
I think it would be fun for the faithful. I don't know that it's that interesting to the skeptics, because they're not... Skeptics today, when it was a Christian culture or the Christian West, skeptics were the one who said, I'm not sure any of this is true. I'm not sure this is true. And, like Sky said, that's skeptics today aren't skeptical about the Bible because by and large, they've written it off years ago, or it's just another, sacred text. And we have lots of sacred texts. They're more skeptical about the Christians, I think. So it's less helpful outside the camp.
I'm a skeptical Christian.
To your point.
No, seriously.
Yeah, that's true.
I'm serious. Sometimes in my mind, I wonder, is this crazy? Like when you listen to the stories that we believe and we choose to believe, they are wacko sometimes. And I sit there and go, gosh, do I really believe this? Is this really true? And then I have to go back and think about my life and stuff that I've learned and put it in context. And it would be easier if there were, solid things you could hang your hat on to be like, yeah, this really happened. I'm a Christian, but I also think I'm skeptical.
Okay. I'll keep feeding you some archaeological stories when I see them pop up.
To sort of verify Christian's point, though, if you remember, we talked about Jonathan Haidt and his argument about how people choose what they believe.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, essentially, most people make an emotional connection and they want to believe something. And after they've made that emotional desire clear, then they build and select the evidence to reinforce what it is they want to believe. So, Christian, you want to believe the Christian faith. And so when you bump up against evidence for or against it, you want to know that there's really good evidence to support it because you're already there. In that regard, you're right. These kinds of stories helps build the credibility for those of us who've already made an emotional commitment to this faith.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Keep bringing them, Phil.
I'll keep bringing them. I will keep bringing them. I also wonder if it's a generational thing, because you and I grew up with Josh McDowell and Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and the kind of the popularity or the populism of apologetics that happened in the 80s and 90s in particular, as we were trying to convince all the skeptics, to come to church, come back to church, come back to church. And they're not coming back to church for a very different reason today than they were in the 1980s. Okay, last story. Can you laugh at your enemies and love them? Or, to be even more provocative, are there rules for Christian mockery?
Well, Phil, why don't you answer that? Because you've just had a big tangle on Twitter.
Is this timely? Yeah. Yeah, I had a tangle Twitter over whether mockery was appropriate. And if not, do I do it? And am I inappropriate? And that was confounding. So, John Stonestreet, who runs Breakpoint, the Chuck Colson radio show and radio ministry, kind of a, cultural commentary, semi-apologetic ministry started by Chuck Colson. And with the famous alumni like Eric Metaxas, who worked there for a spell over the years. John Stonestreet wrote this article, and he talks about Twitter. He talks about what's going on Twitter. I can't help but wonder, because he mentions the Babylon Bee, I can't help but wonder if maybe he was watching some of the stuff that was going on Twitter 2 weeks ago. Some argue that on certain occasions, mockery, if done right, is acceptable in a time in a time as morally and culturally insane as ours, because we're in the first morally and culturally insane time in human history, could it even be useful for discrediting wicked and foolish people in powerful places? And then he quotes from a paper that was written by, let's see, who was it written by? Brendan Case, who talks about 17th century mathematician and Christian apologist Blaise Pascal. And when we're looking, for truth in the matter, we always turn to Blaise Pascal. It's the first place you go. So,
not a bad source.
Not a bad source. In his 11th provincial letter, Pascal included a surprisingly thoughtful defense of Christian mockery. He believed that poking fun at opponents could sometimes be godly and even loving. And he gave 6 criteria for when and how Christians can do it. So I'm going to read Blaise Pascal's 6 criteria for loving mockery. Not loving it, but doing it lovingly.
All right.
Okay. But this is as interpreted by this Chase character.
Brendan Chase.
Chase. So,
but this is quoting from Pascal.
Is it a quote, direct quotes?
Most of it.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
Except the last two of the 6 Case brings out of, I think he was implying this, but he didn't say it explicitly. The others he says explicitly. Okay, Blaise Pascal talking to Phil Vischer through the centuries. From the, when did Blaise Pascal live? I already said it, but it was, when did he live? Never mind. A long time ago.
17th century, I think.
First, argued Pascal, Christians must speak only the truth. Okay, I'm good with that. So you can't, if you're going to mock someone, don't make stuff up. So there goes political advertising. That's pretty much, Christians can't do political advertising. Yes, Guy?
Well, okay, there are lies of commission and then there's lies of omission. So this is what bothers me about some of what I've seen on Twitter recently and for a long time is you can lie by completely misrepresenting your opponent's point of view by simply not sharing all the facts. So back to the abortion thing that you got into with Babylon B, if somebody were to say, Phil Vischer believes abortion is okay, they could claim, no, we're saying the truth. We're saying the truth, but they failed to say, okay, when the life of the mother is in jeopardy like that, but they leave off that part and it's a lie because they're not telling the whole truth, right?
That's political advertising right there. He says it's okay to run over your family. Oh, because he did it. So he must think it's okay. Okay, that was number 1. So speak the truth. Number 2, we should avoid getting personal. We should ridicule ideas, not people. Okay. Third, we should only mock what is evil, never what is virtuous. Well, why would we be? I'm not sure that's useful because everyone thinks the other side is evil and their side is virtuous. Right?
Right. And it's really hard when we have turned things so upside down, like in parts of American Christian culture right now, to be belligerent is seen as virtuous and to be meek and civil is seen as unvirtuous. So it's easy to mock people for the values. For being you just civil. Redefine what is virtuous and what is evil, and you can get away with anything.
Right. Okay. So that one we declare not wildly helpful, but good try, Pascal. Keep going. What's your next one? Fourth, we should always desire the good and ultimately the salvation of those whose behavior and ideas we mock. That's a tough one, because if I desire someone's good, it's really hard to mock them.
Well, that's a tough point.
Yeah, it's going to be really rare circumstances where you can argue that I am loving my enemy by mocking them. I don't think it's impossible, but that's got to be super, super rare.
Yeah, right. The last 2 principles, which Stone Street says Pascal only implies, so these may not actually be Pascal's principles, may be the most important. We're adding some. If
it's the most important, but we're not sure he actually said it.
He didn't really say this, but these are the most important of his 6 principles. First, we should punch up, never down. So mock people with more power than you, not less power.
Okay. 2 things here. The whole punch up, punch down thing, I'm pretty sure is not a 17th century French idiom. So we're definitely importing that onto Pascal. But more importantly, This one's really, I think, also not very helpful because there's, again, a large segment of the Christian, especially white evangelical subculture, which believes that it is perpetually the minority and always in the weaker position. So everyone else is a legitimate target, right? You can go after the trans community because as a white evangelical Christian, you think trans people have more power in the culture than you do. You can go after anybody if you think you're the bottom of the heap and justify it. And it's so sort of like if you are an evangelical Christian, I don't know, in Birmingham, Alabama, you probably have a lot of cultural power. But if you're an evangelical Christian in, I don't know, Vermont or somewhere that's hyper-secularized like San Francisco, then you probably don't have a lot of cultural power. So how do you determine who's really up and who's down and which way you're punching?
You know what we need, Guy, Christian? We need an app.
Yes.
We need an app that can sense our situation, our social position. Are we up? Are we down from this target? You point it at the target. I want to mock that guy. You take a picture of them, and the app tells you no. Pascal says no. It's a picture of Pascal and his thumb up or his thumb down. How about that?
Somebody better get on that.
Yeah, let's make that. Yeah. That'd be cool.
Pascal determining who's a legitimate target. Yeah. I honestly think that this is part of the reason why some Christians are so quick to claim victimhood, because it gives them license to be jerks. Ooh. It gives them a license to be mean. And it's based on this premise that if I'm only punching up, you can't, I'm only attacking the man, so you can't blame me. But that's a weird and twisted reason to want to assume a place of cultural victimhood.
Right. And if you've decided you're now at the bottom of your society, there's no way to punch down. You're just punching the ground.
Exactly.
That's not fun.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes, Christian.
What is the purpose of mocking? So when we mock, whether we're punching up or down, what do we hope the end result will be? Is it, truthfully, I mean, I'm asking.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, okay, I'll answer your question in a second here, Christian, but it relates to that this principle that they're saying Pascal stood for contradicted with the one he said earlier, which is you're not supposed to mock people, you're only supposed to mock ideas. And if you're mocking ideas, then this concept of punching up or down is irrelevant.
Yeah.
Because it's not about people and their power. It's about the idea. To your point, Christian, there are some ideas which are so ridiculous and so blatantly foolish that sometimes it is helpful to unveil how ridiculous that idea is. So as a warning, essentially, as a way of keeping people away from it, exposing its own foolishness. So I don't think that's necessarily bad. And I think that's the purpose it's to build wisdom. Sometimes the way we build wisdom is by revealing the foolishness of the alternative way of thinking.
So
Jesus does this all the time. The prophets did this all the time, but they didn't always go after people.
For example, when Rudy Giuliani suggested that probably ships full of fake ballots came from China to Maine during the election, and that's why Donald Trump lost. That is a ridiculous idea, worthy of some level of mockery. But that mockery should not be about how ridiculous Rudy Giuliani looked when he said that idea because his hair dye was running down his face. Because now you're just attacking a person who was made in the image of God and is loved by God. And he didn't know his hair dye was going to run when he got sweaty in front of the thing that he thought was the Four Seasons Hotel, but turned out to be a landscaping center. That's easy to mock, but stick to the idea. The idea that China had boats full of ballots docking in secret in Maine, of all places, to throw an election. That's kind of a funny idea. I don't know. I don't think I do it well all the time, and I'm trying to not mock. Oh, but we didn't get to the sixth one. The sixth one, Pascal's sixth and final idea that he didn't think of, but was thought of for him. Mockery is a last resort for use on the unreasonable after appeals to reason have failed. I agree that it's not a first or second or third resort. I don't know what you're accomplishing. It's like, this person is so unreasonable. But see, that's talking about a person too. We're supposed to be talking about ideas.
Right.
An idea can't be unreasonable. This idea is not reasoning with me. I must mock it. That doesn't make sense.
I just don't understand how you separate the person from the idea.
Yeah.
You can. It's possible. I mean, I'm thinking of the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus talks about if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, and if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. Like some interpreters are arguing that Jesus is mocking the idea that you can externally conform to the expectations of the law, and he's taken the logic of it to its natural end, which is gouge out your eye and cut off your hand. It's so ridiculous. He's kind of mocking the notion that by taking it to its extreme, but he's not mocking a particular person or teacher. But there were a group of teachers in Israel who were advocating for the point of view that he's mocking, but he doesn't call them out by name or in person. Although he does certainly mock the Pharisees in Matthew 23. So, but he's Jesus and I'm not. It's a little bit like anger. I think there is a place for righteous anger, but I think I trust Jesus to use anger redemptively. I don't trust myself to use it redemptively. And mockery it's kind of like that. I think it could be used redemptively, but not often.
Well,
certainly not by immature believers.
It's very hard to, when Jesus says, he who calls a man fool is the same as a murderer. It's very hard to say, oh, but I'm doing it in the right way, Jesus.
Right.
I'm not like all those other people that do what you said. I'm insulting this guy or demeaning this guy to save him from the fires of hell, which I've heard quite a bit, and I don't buy it. So I'm trying to figure out, when are you being ironic? Not, when are you not demeaning, but you're just playfully engaging with an idea and showing it to be a little silly? Because I love doing that, but I can't figure out where the line is, and I don't want to make a habit of crossing it.
Right. I love that you're challenging yourself on that. That's a great example, I think, for all of us. To kind of look at ourselves and think, where do I need to tweak things a little bit?
Yeah. Where do I need to revise my modus operandi going forward? I don't need to engage every bad idea I see on Twitter. It's not productive.
That sounds like your wife speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one other piece here related to that last idea of mockery should be your last resort when everything else has failed. Again, we know from research from people like Jonathan Haidt that people do not change their mind because they're being ridiculed, right? They dig in their heels at that point. So if you think mockery is going to convince your opponent to change their point of view, it's over. Remember in the 2016 presidential campaign when Hillary Clinton, I think, was caught on a hot mic or somewhere she was recorded as referring to Donald Trump's fans or supporters as deplorable, basket of deplorables? Did anybody who was supporting Trump go, you know what, maybe Hillary Clinton's right and I should vote for someone else instead? Yeah. No, they printed up T-shirts proudly identifying themselves as the deplorables, right? So the mockery never works in actually changing someone's mind. And so, if that's the goal.
But it makes my audience think I'm funny and cool. And that makes me feel good.
Now we're at the heart of the issue.
That makes me feel good when they say, yeah, you owned them. You destroyed them. Actually, whenever someone has said that, like, man, look, Phil destroyed this guy. I just feel really concerned. Like, I wasn't trying. I don't want to destroy people. That's not good. I don't even like the language we use around, social media mockery. So anyway, what do you guys think? Do you think Pascal is right? Do you like the ideas Pascal came up with, the two that he didn't come up with, but almost came up with? So we helped him. I'm not mocking anyone, just so you know. I'm just having some fun. And I'm going to try to keep doing that gently. And thank you, Patreon supporters. You can listen to Christian Asks on Patreon. You can listen to Get Schooled by Caitlin Shass on Patreon. So sign up. We got really good content. We got a good interview today. Right, Sky?
We do.
Oh, totally good. And here it comes. So stay around and listen. Thanks, y'all. See you next week.
Bye, everybody.
The Holy Post podcast is supported by listeners like you. This episode is also supported by Biola University's Talbot School of Theology. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. That's 2 Timothy 2:15, and it was the theme verse of the Bible club I was in as a kid. Christians always say they take the Bible seriously, yet YouTube videos of pastors using the Bible to teach that man buns are sinful or that hating our enemies is fine if they're Marxists remind us we'd all be better off if we spent more time learning the Bible before we tried teaching it. And that's where Biola University's Talbot School of Theology can help. Learn the Bible for reals with Talbot's online programs. Talbot is a nationally recognized seminary with an outstanding faculty that can help you learn the Bible wherever you are on your schedule. Invest some time in taking the Bible seriously. Learn more about Talbot's online programs at biola.edu/Talbot. That's biola.edu/TALBOT. And now, back to the show.
It's hard to think of a less practiced and more guilt-inducing discipline than the Sabbath. There was a time when our entire society shut down on Sunday so that we could all rest as Scripture commanded. But today you see that even rarely practiced among Christians. We're so busy both with activities at church and youth sports and other things going on in the world that most of us never get a chance to slow down. And that doesn't even take account of our digital lives, which never stop. Well, that's why I'm happy that my guest today has written a whole book about the importance of developing a rhythm of rest. Ruth Haley Barton is a spiritual director and the founder of the Transforming Center, a ministry dedicated to strengthening the souls of pastors and Christian leaders. Ruth and I have known each other for a long time, and I've been incredibly indebted to her work in helping us think about how to take spiritual formation ideas and employ them both on the level of church leadership, but then within our church communities as well. And her new book does that with the issue of Sabbath. It's called Embracing Rhythms of Work and Rest, From Sabbath to Sabbatical and Back Again. And beyond just an exploration of the biblical or historical practice of Sabbath, the book is actually deeply personal, and Ruth talks about her own crisis that led her to begin to practice this and the way she incorporates Sabbath not just as a weekly day of rest, but an entire lifestyle, from brief moments of pausing throughout the day to longer seasons of sabbatical. And in our conversation, you'll hear her talk about the challenges we face uniquely today when it comes to issues of technology and society that create greater barriers to actually developing rest. One quick note, towards the end of our conversation, we had a little hiccup with the technology, so if you're watching this on YouTube, the last few minutes don't include video, but the rest of it does. Hopefully it's not a distraction for you engaging the great content that Ruth is bringing. Okay, here's my conversation with Ruth Haley Barton. Ruth Haley Barton, welcome to the Holy Post.
It's great to be here, Sky. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, sorry for the false start with the technology snafu, but we were discussing the last time we were together, and you think it was the National Pastors Conference in San Diego?
Yes, many, many moons ago. Yep.
Yeah, that was when I was a Leadership Journal, and it has to be more than 10 years ago. But
yeah, probably 15 maybe even.
Yeah, it could be. Well, you've certainly been productive, and your latest book proves that. And ironically, it's a book about not being productive or deliberately not being productive, embracing rhythms of work and rest. You've been in this realm of spiritual formation from before it was super popular. And before we get into the content of your book, I'm curious to just, over the course of your ministry, how have you seen reception to these ideas, the broader ideas around spiritual formation, change?
Oh, yeah. I really appreciate the question because it really has changed. In the very beginning, there was a lot of resistance and a lot of false bifurcation between things like formation and mission. There was definitely suspicion about whether or not it was Buddhist or New Age philosophy or something like that. So some of us paid a price for that. And to stay, to try to stay true to what we saw it as really being about. So now, of course, it's all the rage. And I actually get afraid sometimes that some people see it as a trend or that it is a trend versus something that really is so foundational, the way I understand it, so foundational to the spiritual life and the Christian life and the message of the church. So one of the things that I've tried to uphold the last 20 years is that spiritual formation is central to the message of the gospel and therefore central to the mission of the church. But that has been a hard truth to actually continue to put forward and see it, have buy-in across the board. So I continue to kind of champion that idea and, and I see a lot of good movement, but I do get concerned when it seems like it's a trend versus something that's much more foundational than that, because I do believe it's much more foundational than just a trend.
Right. And I know a lot of your work over the years has been with church leaders and ministry leaders. And I wonder, as we've seen this flurry of tragic implosions over the last number of years in large public ministries hitting the rocks, has that made your message more receptive for other church leaders? Is it affecting it in any way? Are more church leaders coming to you going sort of preventative medicine, like, hey, can you help me because I don't want to end up like so many of the stories I'm reading?
Yeah, I think that, they definitely are cautionary tales, and you can point to them if you wish, and, I never want to do that in an opportunistic way, because that would be awful. But it does show that when there is high levels of achievement and productivity and growth and things like that, without an appropriate grounding in one's formational journey and in what God is doing and saying at the soul level, and rhythms, that are sane for us as human beings. And also, the ongoing process of transformation for all of us that have to do with Christ's character being formed in us, and things like humility and realism and being willing to live within our limits and being willing to have accountability. All those things are very formational dynamics. And if we're not willing to engage those and have them be a part of our lives, then we are fragile and vulnerable, and in many cases subject to things that we would not want to have be the outcome of our lives. So yes, you can point to those things in such a way as to say, this is how important it is. If we're not grounded in these dynamics of the spiritual life, we are in a pretty vulnerable position.
Yeah, I'm also kind of hesitant to make that a motivation, partly because it feels like spiritual formation then, and this particular practice of Sabbath that you've written about, simply become a pragmatic way of increasing either productivity or longevity.
Right.
And it bypasses the whole call to actually live in communion with God, which is what these practices are primarily about. When we make them utilitarian, something critical is lost in our perspective.
Yes.
And speaking of that, and your new book on Sabbath, you begin by sharing about your own story, your own discovery and need for Sabbath. Can you kind of share that story a little bit, what brought you to recognize the value of this practice?
Yes. I start the book with a sentence that to some people is quite startling, and that is that I am pretty convinced that if it wasn't for the practice of Sabbath, I wouldn't even be here doing what I'm doing. Barbara Brown Taylor has that wonderful question, what's saving your life these days? And if you were to ask me, it would be Sabbath. Sabbath is what is saving my life these days and every day. And so I love all the other spiritual practices, but this one is the one that literally, keeps me on the earth and keeps me on a straight path and a good path. But the awareness of that and my need for it came in my early 40s when I had been on the performance treadmill for a while. I do have that sort of vein running through me that's kind of achievement oriented, and I'm a pastor's kid, so I'd been working in spiritual environments and, trying to serve Jesus by that time for well over 20 years, and had been teaching and guiding other people in spiritual practices, but actively resisting this one, actively resisting Sabbath. And so I did have a biking accident where I was riding my bike and someone who was stopped at a stop sign pulled forward when they should have stayed stopped. And so we collided and I went down and got run over, actually. And, that experience was not created by God. God did not make that happen, but God certainly used it in my life, because at that point, for one thing, I got up off the pavement and the next day I went back to work. And I had a friend who said, Ruth, you could take a day off. You did just get run over by a car. And I thought, really? Yes, And so I had been reading about Sabbath at this point, but had only allowed myself to feel the beauty of it all and to resonate with the beauty of it all. I'd read Wayne Mueller's book on Sabbath and Rabbi Heschel, but I had continued to put it in the too hard file for me. And it was about the fact that it felt too hard. I was a mom with, teenage kids and things like that, so I didn't know how our family would be able to put it all together. I was on staff at a church, and we know that Sundays are a really busy day for church staff. My husband's a banker, and so his bank was open on Sundays, so it just seemed completely impossible. But I was finally acknowledging my desire and my longing and my need for a way of life that worked, for a way of life that was more doable and sustainable. And God used the recovery period after that biking accident to give me an opportunity to walk into my desire more fully and more deeply, and my need and my desperation. And to finally say to God, you know what? If this is a gift that you're holding out for me, this is something that you know I need because you are my creator. It's been just a beautiful dream before, but I'm going to really take hold of my desire and see if I can't walk in. And I drove a new stake in the ground at that point and just trusted that God would meet me in that desire and that God would show me the way. And so it was in my early 40s when I really began to embrace this practice and to experience it as one of God's greatest gifts. I tell people I fall in love with God again every single Sabbath because God is so good that God would choose to give me a gift like this. So that's the whole spirit of it for me now, but it's been quite a journey.
Yeah, I'm going back to that accident and your recovery and your realization. There's two things that you highlighted in that story, even as you retold it, that I think a lot of people can identify with. The first is the guilt or impracticality you feel around this.
The sense of impossibility, yes.
Right. So some of us, people raised in the church perhaps, remember being told about Sabbath or preached Sabbath messages in their churches, and there was a sense of, I guess I should do that, but I don't. And so it's a very guilt-inducing topic. But then on another front, it's just impractical. It's impossible. I mean, you mentioned being in your early 40s with a family. People look at the circumstances of their lives and think, okay, this was an ancient practice that was a lot easier to employ before modern technology, and we'll get into that in a minute. But you mentioned Wayne Mueller's book, and you quote him early in your book, and this is so important. He wrote, if we do not allow for a rhythm of rest in our overly busy lives, illness becomes our Sabbath. Our pneumonia, our cancer, our heart attack, our accidents create Sabbath for us. So in a sense, he's arguing, it sounds like you're arguing, that Sabbath is going to happen one way or another. And we can either choose to step into that voluntarily with incorporating it as a rhythm of our life, or it will be thrust upon us against our will through circumstances we didn't choose. Because we are finite creatures. Yeah. And sooner or later, we need recovery and rest. Talk a little bit about how do you deal with the guilt-inducing nature of it and the baggage people carry around this topic?
I really appreciate the question because I, too, was raised, as I said, in a pastor's family, and we did practice the Sabbath, but we did it in a very legalistic way. And so I did kick this practice to the curb when I left my family's home, and I was really happy to leave it behind and to establish my life rhythms, continuing to be able to work hard and get things done and achieve and everything else 7 days a week. And so that's an interesting part of the story, is that I know that way of practicing the Sabbath, and I'm very sensitive to it. And I think that's why in this book I really do make the emphasis of the fact that, number one, Sabbath begins with God. And when God called a people to himself, God embedded a rhythm that God himself had practiced into the life of those he cared for and those he was loving and leading and shepherding. And then that Sabbath really is a gift, even though, yes, it is a 10 Commandment. It actually preceded the 10 Commandments. So it was given on its own by itself as a gift. And that when God first gave it, God was a liberating God who gave it to the people that he was delivering from oppression. So, I mean, to them, it was one of the greatest gifts they could have received because it was sign, symbol, and lived reality of the fact that they were being liberated from the pharaohs, being liberated from the harsh taskmasters, being liberated from bondage and living as an oppressed people. So we really do have to keep in mind that this was a great gift that was given to God's people. It's only human beings that make something legalistic out of it. We seem to have a pretty good gift for that, human beings taking a great gift from God and turning it into a legalistic requirement. So I do emphasize in the book this whole idea that it is a gift, and that now part of the shift for me was that I began to see it as God's great gift to me, not an obligation or a should or something to feel guilty about, but actually something really, really good that the God who loves me and knows me really wants to give me. And that's been a revelation in this early part of the release of the book. Many, many people are commenting on the emphasis in the book on the fact that Sabbath is a gift and that it's a winsome invitation. And I experience it that way. I'm grateful that God brought it back to me in a winsome and inviting way versus the legalistic way that I had originally experienced it. And I no longer feel one iota of obligation. It's all about the gift now, and it's the best part of every week for me.
One of the ways you emphasize the gift nature of Sabbath is recognizing that it's more than just a day of rest. And going back to the Old Testament again, Sabbath becomes sort of an organizing principle throughout the life and religious practices of Israel, even the economic practices.
That's right.
And you bring up how, for you, Sabbath, it's a day of rest from work. You extend that forward into sabbatical and a whole season of rest. But you also talk about very small moments of being aware of God's presence or taking a pause at a moment in the day where all these things become a normal rhythm of life.
Yeah, that's right.
How does that expand people's understanding of this being a gift rather than just, it's a day I'm supposed to not do something?
Yeah. Well, you're right. I do emphasize the fact that Sabbath is a way of life, and I actually like to call it a Sabbath way of life versus a day, because the whole week needs to be ordered around making Sabbath even possible. So 5 days for doing the work of being human, and then 5 days for paid work, and then the sixth day is for the work of being human, and all of it is leading to the seventh day, which is the climax of the week. And the whole rest of the week has to be ordered around this intention to practice Sabbath. And yes, once you become familiar with the dynamics of Sabbath and the ceasing in order to rest, then there can be smaller moments too. So, for instance, another practice that I rely on and that I'm utterly committed to is the practice of solitude and silence. And the way that I was drawn into the practice of solitude and silence was to see solitude coupled with silence as a time of rest in God. That before solitude can be anything, it needs to be a place of rest in God. And that came for me first. Once I began to really enter into Sabbath keeping, I realized, the way that I've been practicing solitude and silence is actually a place of Sabbath rest. That solitude and silence now for me is a place of rest daily. And then once I learned the dynamics of resting in God and being open and receptive to God and letting God do what God's going to do in those moments, then there can even be Sabbath pauses where I can build in a bit of a Sabbath pause in between meetings, or before entering into a meeting, I can take 60 seconds to collect myself and, orient myself to God and rest in God before I enter into a difficult meeting or something like that. Or the transition from the workday into the evening, we could incorporate a little bit of entering into a more restful space. So, it's definitely,
Was it Eugene Peterson who said that being a pastor is simply helping people pay attention to God? I think that was his definition. And when I was reading this part of your book where you're talking about those smaller Sabbath pauses and practices, it seemed like, well, that's exactly what you're doing. You're just carving out space to pay attention to God and
That's
resting from the outward activity to be reminded and aligned again with Him, so that as you enter into that next activity, you're doing it with Him and not
and I like the
unaware
word
of His presence.
Yeah, and I like the word reorientation, because in the middle of a work day or whatever, we can get, if we want to say it, disoriented. We can become completely oriented to the external factors of what's happening in our day, completely oriented to, the dynamics that we're in the middle of, completely oriented to achievement or, whatever's going on in the culture. And that in the silent pause, we can actually reorient ourselves to God as the ultimate orienting reality of our lives. No matter how far we've slipped and gotten away from knowing our connection to God, we can actually use those Sabbath pauses to reorient ourselves to the ultimate orienting reality of the presence of God in our lives.
So I want to, before we wrap up, I want to talk about two challenges to practicing Sabbath that you talk about in the book. But before that, I want to talk about one other important chapter you had that I think is really valuable. Many of us have been taught about Sabbath, and we know that the word means rest, and that's all we tend to associate with it. But you have a whole chapter on how Sabbath is about delight. Explain what you mean by that.
Yeah. Well, there is that phrase in Isaiah 58 that talks about calling the Sabbath a delight. If you call the Sabbath a delight, and then, there's all these blessings that flow from it. And so that's another word that's, to me, really associated with the gift nature of Sabbath, is that on the Sabbath we are invited to identify what we delight in, and those things that we delight in just because those are human things or because God has created us in such a way that those are delightful to us, and that the Sabbath is oriented around rest, worship, and delight, and that we have this invitation to just reflect on what do I truly delight in, and how can I organize a whole day around what I delight in. And oftentimes it's the simpler pleasures of life as well, that because we are withdrawing from consumerism, hopefully, I do talk about what we exclude on the Sabbath. We exclude work, we exclude worry, and we exclude consumerism. That if we see this as a day to unplug also from the consumeristic demands of life in our culture, then we are set up to actually delight in God's good gifts to us, the simple pleasures of home and children and spouse and family, and walking through crunchy leaves and going for a run just because we love it, or playing pickup basketball, or laying in the sun and swinging in a hammock, or preparing really beautiful food, or engaging whatever art we love. That all of those things are just things we delight in, and we're invited to fill up a whole day with things that delight us. That's pretty amazing. Who wouldn't love a day like that, right?
Yeah, that's. I think if more people had Sabbath presented to them in that light, it wouldn't be such a guilt-inducing and struggle for so many Christians. But let's talk about what is a struggle for a lot of Christians. And there's two things I want to bring out from there's so many things worth talking about, but these two things I think our audience will find really relevant. The first is the fact that when you started incorporating this into your own life 20-some years ago, we didn't have smartphones.
That's right.
And you do a whole chapter here on the challenge of technology, and you cite some really great folks that I've been reading, and I know we've talked about on the show before, like Sherry Turkle from Alone Together, some other researchers about the psychological malformation and mental health challenges that are occurring because of these devices. What have you found in your practice to mitigate against the influence of technology to actually create those oases of rest in your life?
Yes. Well, I have really come to believe that one of the areas where we actually really need rest is rest from the stimulation of life in technology. And technology is neutral for the most part. What makes it, not so neutral is how we get addicted to it and how we use it, or how we fail to have any limits around it. And so I think a source of exhaustion that we have not named always fully yet is the exhaustion that comes from always being plugged in and always being connected and always being stimulated by whatever is coming in through our smartphones. And actually through our smartphones, one of the things that's changed in the 20 years that I've practiced is that it used to be that at least you could close your computer and close your email, and that was the end of that. But now, if we if we have a smartphone, or even if we have an Apple Watch, our work and our emails can actually come in through our devices, and so we're never unplugged. And that means that we're never unplugged from our work, and we're never unplugged from consumerism, and we're never unplugged from the news and the way in which news fosters worry and anxiety and stress within us. So in this book, more than any other book I've written, I am being very, very clear and driving a stake in the ground that I think that on the Sabbath we need to find ways to unplug from our technologies. And it's a big thing to say. It feels impossible, and yet it is possible. And one of the things that I hope that chapter would do was get really practical about how it is possible, and actually, I believe, necessary for true mental rest. We need to have some unplugging going on.
Yeah. Before COVID, I used to, and I do a little bit now, but I used to speak pretty regularly at Christian colleges and universities, and very often highly controversial topics will come up, differences on matters of sexuality and politics and all kinds of other things that people get stirred up about. I have never had students be more upset with me than when I have challenged them in their addiction to their cell phones.
Yeah.
And I made a statement somewhere about that these devices are going to be the greatest challenge to your intimacy with God, and that we need to cultivate boredom and disconnection from these things. And I've had students pretend like I was asking them to cut off a limb. And I mean, it is a generational thing, but they have no living memory. At least you and I are old enough to remember the world before these devices. But this younger generation doesn't, and so they can't imagine what that would look like, and it's not being modeled for them anywhere. You talk about some really practical things that you've adapted from Jewish practice, like a Sabbath box. Can you describe what that is?
Yeah, in the Sabbath tradition, there was a Sabbath box. Many families would have a Sabbath box, and they, at the beginning of Sabbath, they would put things related to their work into that box as a symbol of the fact that they were ceasing their work. And I think that disconnecting from work is, of course, at the heart of Sabbath keeping. But these days, what I have found that what's even more important is to put my cell phone either into a Sabbath box, or I actually have a Sabbath drawer, and to actually put it out of sight. Not only turn it off, but get it out of sight. And that, and even the computer, and now our computers are slim enough that we could maybe put them into a Sabbath drawer, into a Sabbath box. But to put those things related not only to our work, but to unplug our technologies and even put that into the Sabbath box as a way of getting them out of sight and unplugging from them. And I've worked with it in different ways throughout all the years, but I think the idea of a Sabbath box, the concept there is that we put the things in there that keep us from ceasing. And we do that as a symbolic ritual action, but it's also the reality itself. If you actually do put your phone or your computer away and out of sight, then it's actually not just a ritual. It's actually the reality itself of becoming unplugged.
In your book, you cite some research from different folks, including Sherry Turkle, who have cited that even the presence of a phone,
yes,
impacts the conversation two people will have, even if there's no alerts, if there's no ring, like just having it there, because there's the anticipation that I might at any moment be interrupted. So I'm not going to let this conversation get too in depth.
That's
because
right.
I need to keep myself free to be torn away from it. And I mean, I've talked to, again, young people, but even some of my peers who are like, well, isn't it enough just to turn the phone off or just to put it on do not disturb mode for a while? And the case is strong to say, no, we need regular times where they are just not even present. And I even wonder in some of our church gatherings, if like some traditions that will remove their shoes before they enter a sacred space, do we need to remove our phones and leave them outside so that we can be fully present with one another and with God?
You could really wish and hope for that, and I hope it happens someday. What's so interesting, of course, is that sometimes now churches during church services are actually encouraging people to text and all that. And I'm like, oh, come on, really, we cannot do that. I mean, that is a disaster in my mind. I'm sorry to say. I think the church needs to go the other way. And like you said, help people to see worship and worship services as a sacred space where we do leave our technologies aside. I was thinking about, your comment about working with college students. One of the things that I find so hard about going into college settings right now, and I don't even do it much anymore, and this is one of the reasons, is that you can see it as the speaker. You can see the lights of the cell phones.
Right.
You can see that people are on their cell phones while you're speaking, and it's one of the rudest things I could ever imagine.
Ruth, I just assume every one of them is taking copious notes on what I'm saying.
Yes, I know, and they're reading their Bibles. They're finding their Bibles on their phones, right, and following carefully along with you in the Bible passage that you are discussing. Yes, you just keep believing that, Sky.
Makes me feel better.
Oh, it does make you feel better. So a lot of times I don't even consider those kinds of invitations because there are no boundaries around.
Yeah.
When I go speak myself and I do what I do the way I do it, I actually have a ritual around setting aside our cell phones and turning them off and really asking people to do that. And we alert people ahead of time that we are expecting people to be off their cell phones. When I have that kind of control, then I'll do it. But I won't go into many settings these days where I can at least get people to unplug that way, because it's not about just being rude to a speaker, but also I understand what it takes for the soul to connect with God. Yeah. And I want people to be in touch with what the Holy Spirit is saying. And I want them to be present to God in the depths of their being through the time that we're together. And I know that cell phones and being on that way make that impossible. And personally, I think the evil one comes against it. The minute God starts to stir in our souls with the true question or the true truth that we need to be interacting with, I think the evil one is right there with some sort of a text from somebody, with some sort of a phone call that comes through or whatever, just to make sure that we don't connect with God in the depths of our beings. And so this is really important spiritually, I think.
Right. What's interesting, and you've mentioned Sherry Turkle in your book. Her research and writing has been so helpful, and this is coming from an entirely secular point of view. Whether you attribute it to the enemy or not, there's plenty of data that says when we start having challenging feelings, or we just become self-aware of our own inadequacies, insecurities, guilt, whatever it might be, grief, when that starts bubbling up inside of us, we want to push it back down, and the quickest way to do that is to grab our cell phone and distract ourselves. And yet, those things that bubble up within us are the basic building blocks of intimacy, whether that's intimacy with another human being where we have something to share, or intimacy with God where we can come before him and say, here I am. This is what's really in me. But if we never learn that self-awareness and comfort with that self-awareness, we cannot develop a deeper communion with God. And so I think there's a deep spiritual reality to that, as you mentioned, and there's just a deep human psychological reality to it that we can't afford to ignore.
Yeah, that's how we distract ourselves. And I think if another way to talk about what happens for a person on the Sabbath, in addition to the fact that they cease their work and rest, is that I myself personally experience it as a very intimate time with God, because I don't have any of the other distractions, and I also have a sense of God loving me through the goodness of the Sabbath, that the Sabbath has become a time when I just feel God's presence so intimately with me. And as I go deeper and deeper into the quiet and being disconnected, then hopefully somewhere along the way on the Sabbath, I begin to say something true to God. And I hear something true back. And so in the book, and you will have noticed this, there's a section at the end of every chapter, What Your Soul Wants to Say to God, where I encourage people, rather than just reading on, to stop and to pay attention to what's stirring in their souls and to try to say something true to God before moving on, and then also to leave enough space open that God can say something true to our souls, because the Sabbath is a very intimate practice in my experience, when we, without all the distraction, have the opportunity to experience a great deal of intimacy, even in the hard places. And I do talk in the book about the fact that when we create space, oftentimes some of the harder emotions come and they surface, and what to do in those moments on the Sabbath, instead of thinking, I must be doing something wrong because I'm feeling my grief and I'm feeling my pain and my disillusionment. No, you're actually not doing anything wrong. It shows that you're getting in touch with what's real within you, and then there's an opportunity to be with that with God, rather than entering into the kind of distractions that we might enter into other times of the week.
Okay, Ruth, one last question I really wanted to tackle, because it's another topic you bring up in the book, and that is practicing Sabbath it's even though it's an intimate, private thing often, and you talked about the way you can commune with God and speak honestly to him and hear honestly from him. At the end of the day, this is one of those disciplines that's really hard to practice consistently on your own. It works so much better when we do it in community, or even as a society, as ancient Israel did. Yeah. So talk about how you have dealt with that in your own life and built the structures and communities around you to make it more feasible, lower the bar a little bit to engage this practice.
Yeah. Yes, you are right to call out a theme that found its way throughout this book, and that is that Sabbath is not a private discipline that we're all supposed to be figuring out by ourselves. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we have been trying to figure it out by ourselves versus seeing it as a communal discipline that God gave to a group of people when he gave it to the Israelites, and he now gives it to us. But because we're trying to practice it individually, it's hard to get traction. And so in this book, I do develop the theme of it being a communal practice. And I share the experience of not being on staff at a church for a while and going to a church as a, quote, normal parishioner, and hoping that in being just a normal parishioner and not somebody on staff at a church, that I could actually experience Sabbath with my family. I was really excited about that. But we got involved in this church just as a normal family and found out that they scheduled everything on Sundays. Youth group meetings, small group meetings, congregational meetings, choir practices, whatever. They filled up the Sunday with all the stuff. And I know why they did it. I think it's because in our very, very busy culture, we think, well, we're not going to get everybody back. And Sunday's the only day we've got. So we've got to just put everything into Sunday. But I realized that unless Sabbath is a communal commitment, then we're going to do all sorts of other things with Sundays. And I had to make the devastating awareness and discovery that it was not really the secular culture that was keeping me from practicing Sabbath. It was actually the church that was keeping me from practicing Sabbath. And that was a really hard discovery. So I am really hoping that in this book and with the conversation guide that's included, that whole communities will begin to grapple with this together, and that churches in particular will begin to embrace a Sabbath life together, and then wonder, so what do we need to do with Sundays in order to make it possible for people to have a Sabbath? Because I think Sunday for most people is the only day that's really realistic. It's the only day that's even slightly different than all the other days, even though it's not as different as it used to be. Sky, you mentioned our ages and the fact that we can remember a day when we weren't on technology all the time before the smartphone. Well, you and I are also old enough to remember a culture where stores weren't open on Sundays and banks weren't open on Sundays and kids didn't play club sports on Sundays. That was a thing. It used to be supported by culture that there was a different rhythm on Sundays, a different quality of time on Sundays that we could accomplish. And now that's missing as well for the most part. But still, for most people, Sundays is still the only day where Sabbath might even be possible, which means that the church's role is really significant. What are we going to do with Sundays? And how are we going to guide people and cast vision and actually lead them, not only through our teaching and preaching, but also through our scheduling, to actually begin to think about having a Sabbath? And even if they don't get the 24 hours, is there any way we could help people get 4 hours or 6 hours or an evening or something that is a different quality of presence than what they would otherwise have if we don't lead out on it?
I mean, that all speaks to the importance of leadership in the church.
Absolutely.
And if they're not owning this, and you talk about this in the book as well, if they're not owning this, it's not going to permeate through the rest of the community. I'm thinking back to when I was on staff at a church, and one of the reasons we tended to put so much on Sunday, and the excuse we would give, is because, well, the rest of the culture is so busy every other day of the week that we're forced. We'd prefer not to have to do everything on Sunday, but we have to because it's all taken up, which is maybe not the best excuse. But then the other thing is I left my pastoral role in 2008, but I stayed at the same church. And so for the first time, as an adult anyway, I found myself in the pew more than the pulpit. Yeah. And I was working at Christianity Today, 40, 50 hours a week, had a young family, and I'd come in on Sunday morning and sit there. And these are my friends and colleagues who are still on staff, and I know they did it with the best of intent because I had done it with the best of intent. But Sunday morning felt like I was getting bombarded with advertisements. Like all the good things the church is doing that we want you to be aware of and we want you to be a part of, and half of it was scheduled for later on Sunday or something. And it was like, there was no Sabbath there. There was no rest because it felt like the culture was all about work. My life was all about work. Home was all about work. And then I come into church and it's all about now do church work. Yeah. Because that's really important. And there was no space for Sabbath. And eventually I got up into the pulpit again and I kind of talked about this and I apologized to my congregation for the years where I had been up there trying to recruit them into more and more stuff. And there was this primarily white congregation in Wheaton with amens and hallelujahs from the pulpit, from the pews because someone was finally saying it. But Ruth, I can't thank you enough for the book, and not just the book, but the fact that it's a book coming out of a life that's lived it. Like you are not just prescribing something that you haven't spent decades cultivating yourself, and you've seen the need for it. And it comes through in every chapter, and even the guidance at the end of these chapters in your own way of drawing us into deeper communion with God with good questions and thoughtful applications. We need this for sure in our world. So I can't recommend it enough. Again, the book is called Embracing Rhythms of Work and Rest, From Sabbath to Sabbatical and Back Again. Ruth, thanks for being with us.
Oh, thanks for a great conversation, Sky. And let's just pray together that churches all over the place might, come to some awareness that this is part of their leadership, is to lead out in Sabbath communities.
Yeah, and that they come to that awareness before they have to.
That's exactly right. Exactly right. May it be so.
Thank you, Ruth.
The Holy Post Podcast is a production of Holy Post Media. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Help us create more thoughtful Christian media by supporting us at patreon.com/Holy Post. Also, be sure to leave a review on iTunes so more people can discover thoughtful Christian commentary, plus ukulele, and occasional butt news. Visit holypost.com for show notes, news stories, Holy Post merchandise, and much more.